Mexico is a land of rich identity where vibrant indigenous cultures have blended with outside influences to create a remarkable heritage. From the earliest civilizations through the era of European conquest and on to modern political and social transformations, every stage of change has left a lasting mark on the spirit of the people. To understand Mexico as it is today, it is essential to look back at the historical paths that shaped the country. Prehistoric Mexico spans from tens of thousands of years before the Common Era until around 2000 BCE, marking the transition of human communities from the earliest hunter-gatherer bands to a more settled agricultural way of life. Archaeological evidence indicates that between roughly 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, during the last ice age, the first groups of people crossed the Beringia land bridge from Asia into North America and gradually migrated southward into the lands that are now Mexico. The Paleo-Indian period, 26,000 to 8,000 BCE, was characterized by a mobile lifestyle with a reliance on hunting megafauna such as mammoths, camels, and large deer, using finely flaked stone tools and fluted spear points. As the climate warmed in the early Holocene, many large animal species became extinct. Humans entered the Archaic period, 8,000 to 2000 BCE, broadening their diets to include smaller game, shellfish, and wild seeds, while also experimenting with cultivation and establishing semi-sedentary camps near water sources. A decisive turning point was the domestication of plants, beginning with gourds, squashes, and chili peppers, and eventually maize, derived from the wild grass teosinte. Pollen and charred seed remains from the Tehuacan and Balsas valleys demonstrate a long process of maize selection. By the 5th millennium BCE, maize kernels had grown large enough to become a staple food. During the same period, early peoples also domesticated beans, avocados, amaranth, and chia, forming the nutritionally rich triad of maize, beans, and squash that secured year-round subsistence. Pottery appeared around 2500 to 1900 BCE, facilitating cooking and the storage of grains, which in turn encouraged more permanent settlement. Seasonal camps gradually developed into small villages with thatched dwellings and storage pits. Communities crafted groundstone tools, including manos and metats for grinding grains, and managed land and water resources by clearing fields, building terraces, and selecting drought-resistant crops. Early exchange networks emerged. Obsidian from the volcanic highlands of central Mexico, seashells from coastal regions, and greenstone from distant sources were circulated through trade. Social structures began to show mild stratification, with local leaders organizing harvests, rituals, and dispute resolution. Labor roles also became more specialized. Men engaged in hunting and land clearing, while women cultivated, processed food, and wove plant fibers. By about 2000 BCE, much of Mesoamerica supported stable farming villages with economies based on maize, beans, and squash, developed pottery industries, and interregional trade networks. From this foundation, communities entered the formative period, paving the way for the rise of brilliant civilizations such as the Olmec, Teotihuacan, and Maya in the centuries that followed. The ancient civilizations of Mesoamerica flourished for thousands of years before Europeans set foot in the Americas, making the region that is now Mexico a cradle of civilization for the entire continent. From around 1500 BCE to the early 16th century, this land gave rise to a succession of large urban religious centers that advanced in science, architecture, and the arts, leaving behind legacies that remain deeply imprinted to this day. Among the most prominent were 5 civilizations: the Olmec, Teotihuacan, Maya, Toltec, and Aztec, each exerting profound political and cultural influence not only within present-day Mexico, but also across Central America. The story begins with the Olmec, often called the mother civilization of Mesoamerica. Around 1500 BCE, Olmec communities settled in the swampy lowlands along the Gulf of Mexico, mainly in Tabasco and Veracruz. They developed distinctive art and religion, leaving behind colossal stone heads weighing several tons, as well as ceremonial sites that reflect a society with ruling elites and complex belief systems. The Olmec may also have pioneered early writing and calendrical systems, laying the groundwork for the hieroglyphic traditions of the region. Their influence spread rapidly. By about 900 BCE, Olmec artistic styles and symbols appeared throughout the Valley of Mexico and as far as Central America, evidence of an extensive network of trade and cultural exchange. Next came Teotihuacan, a great metropolis that emerged around the start of the Common Era and reached its zenith in the 4th and 5th centuries CE. Not the name of a people, but of a city, Teotihuacan was located in the Valley of Mexico and, at its height, was among the largest urban centers in the world, with an estimated population exceeding 200,000. The city was meticulously planned, featuring the Avenue of the Dead, the Pyramid of the Sun, and the Pyramid of the Moon, along with hundreds of temples, residential compounds, and workshops. Its religious, artistic, and commercial influence radiated across Central America, shaping the architecture and rituals of later cultures. Though the ethnic origins of its inhabitants remain debated, the city's legacy established enduring models for subsequent civilizations. In parallel, the Maya built a civilization stretching from Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula into Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Beginning centuries before the Common Era, Maya city-states developed hierarchical societies with kings and noble elites, reaching a brilliant classic period from the 3rd to the 9th centuries CE. The Maya were renowned for their achievements in mathematics, astronomy, and precise calendrical systems, as well as for creating a complex hieroglyphic script, one of the earliest fully developed writing systems of the Americas. Cities such as Tikal, Palenque, Copan, and Chichen Itza erected dazzling pyramids, temples, and plazas that showcased advanced engineering skills. Although many Maya centers declined after the 9th century due to warfare, climate change, or political crises, Maya kingdoms in the Yucatan endured and resisted Spanish conquest until the 16th century. Following the classic Maya era, the Toltec rose in the 10th century in the city of Tula, modern Hidalgo state. In Aztec tradition, the Toltec were revered as masters of culture, to the extent that the word Toltec in Nahuatl became synonymous with artisan. They built impressive temples and colossal warrior statues, demonstrating remarkable sculptural skill, and maintained strong ties with the Yucatan Peninsula, where Toltec influence is evident in the architecture of Chichen Itza. Though much of their history is shrouded in legend, the Toltec served as a vital cultural bridge between the classic and post-classic periods, inspiring the art, religion, and political organization of later peoples. The final pre-Columbian pinnacle was the Aztec Empire, which thrived from the 14th to the early 16th centuries. The Aztec, who called themselves Mexica, migrated into the Valley of Mexico, and in 1325 founded Tenochtitlan on an island in Lake Texcoco, today the heart of Mexico City. Through an alliance with two neighboring city-states, they formed the Triple Alliance and expanded their dominance across central Mexico. The Aztec Empire was renowned for its tightly organized political military system, vast tribute network, and polytheistic religion that emphasized human sacrifice to maintain cosmic order. Tenochtitlan grew into a metropolis of some 200,000 inhabitants, with causeways, canals, temples, and palaces that rivaled the greatest European cities of the era. Yet the empire's wealth and power also bred resentment among neighboring peoples, a factor that contributed to its rapid downfall when the Spanish invaded in 1519. From the Olmec foundations, through the grandeur of Teotihuacan, the scientific brilliance of the Maya, the artistry of the Toltec, and the might of the Aztec, The civilizations of Mesoamerica forged a monumental cultural and technological legacy that defined Mexico before the arrival of Europeans. Their pyramids, calendars, writing systems, diverse beliefs, and trade traditions not only sustained their societies, but also left an indelible mark on modern Mexican identity. The period of Spanish conquest and colonization spanned exactly 3 centuries, leaving a profound imprint on the history, culture, and society of modern Mexico. It began with Hernán Cortés's expedition in 1519. With about 500 soldiers, several dozen cavalrymen, a few small cannons, and the support of many indigenous groups dissatisfied with Aztec rule, Cortés quickly gained the upper hand. After numerous battles and shrewd negotiations, in August 1521, he, together with the Tlaxcala and other native allies, captured Tenochtitlan, taking Emperor Cuauhtémoc prisoner and later executing him. This event ended the Aztec Empire and marked the beginning of 300 years of Spanish rule. Immediately after seizing this vast territory, the Spanish crown established the Viceroyalty of New Spain, with its capital in Tenochtitlan, renamed Mexico City. From then on, Mexico became the most important center of Spain's empire in the Americas, overseeing territories stretching from California, Arizona, and New Mexico to Central America, and even the Philippines in the Pacific. The colonial administration included a viceroy, appointed by the king, the audiencia, and a complex bureaucracy tasked with tax collection, military defense, and ecclesiastical governance. A rigid, racially stratified social-political order was established. At the top were the Peninsulares, Spaniards born on the Iberian Peninsula, who monopolized the highest positions in government, the military, and the church. Below them were the Criollos, people of Spanish descent born in the colonies, wealthy and educated, but often excluded from positions of power, breeding discontent. The Mestizos, of mixed European and indigenous descent, grew in number and formed a middle stratum in economic life. At the bottom were the indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, burdened with heavy labor obligations and discrimination. This system maintained colonial order, serving the interests of the metropolis while legitimizing deep inequality. Economically, Mexico rapidly became the treasury of the Spanish Empire. The encomienda system allowed Spanish landowners to exploit indigenous forced labor for mining and plantation agriculture. The discovery of immense silver deposits at Zacatecas, Guanajuato, and later Chihuahua transformed New Spain into the world's largest source of precious metals at the time. Mexican silver flowed to Seville and Madrid, then on to Asia via the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, fueling the first global economy. In addition to silver, plantations cultivating sugarcane, cacao, tobacco, and coffee expanded, heavily reliant on indigenous forced labor and African slavery. At the same time, the Catholic Church became a central pillar of colonial life. Religious orders such as the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits sent thousands of missionaries to evangelize, establishing hundreds of parishes, monasteries, schools, and hospitals. Catholicism not only converted but also fused with indigenous beliefs, producing unique symbols such as Our Lady of Guadalupe, blending Christian and native traditions. This fusion gradually shaped Mexico's distinctive religious and cultural identity. Yet, colonization also brought demographic catastrophe. Lacking immunity to European diseases, indigenous populations were devastated by smallpox, measles, and influenza, causing numbers to plummet from an estimated 20 to 25 million before Spanish arrival to just a few million within less than a century. This collapse shattered traditional communities and eased the imposition of new colonial economic and social systems. By the 18th century, the Spanish crown launched the Bourbon reforms to tighten control and increase revenues, restructuring taxation, creating a standing army in the colonies, promoting internal commerce, and partially opening ports beyond Seville. These reforms stimulated economic growth, but also produced a wealthy, educated, and militarily trained Criollo class, increasingly resentful of discrimination and exclusion from political power. The combination of racial inequality, economic exploitation, and growing national identity became the spark for independence movements. Thus, 3 centuries of Spanish rule left a lasting legacy. The Spanish language, Catholic religion, European-style urban architecture, legal systems, and trans-Pacific commerce. At the same time, it inflicted suffering and division through the harsh exploitation of resources and peoples. The accumulated social, economic, and racial tensions across generations laid the groundwork for the independence revolt that erupted in the early 19th century, opening a new chapter in Mexico's history. At the dawn of the 19th century, waves of liberal thought from the American Revolution of 1776 and the French Revolution of 1789 spread into New Spain, awakening aspirations to break free from colonial rule. The 1808 invasion of Spain by Napoleon Bonaparte, which deposed King Ferdinand VII and installed a puppet government, weakened the authority of the mother country and created a political vacuum. In this context, the Criollos, Spaniards born in the colonies but excluded from positions of power, together with intellectuals, merchants, peasants, and indigenous peoples, began to demand self-determination. On September 16, 1810, Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, a respected priest, rang the church bell in the town of Dolores and called upon the people to rise against colonial oppression in the historic cry known as the Grito de Dolores. This proclamation quickly transformed into a large-scale armed uprising. At first, the insurgent army, composed of peasants, indigenous people, and mestizos, advanced rapidly, capturing many cities in central Mexico. However, lacking discipline, sound strategy, and facing Spain's professional troops, the rebels were soon suppressed. Hidalgo was captured and executed in 1811, but the spark of resistance endured. Leadership then passed to José María Morelos, a talented priest and brilliant military strategist. He reorganized the forces, expanded operations in the south, and in 1813 convened the Congress of Chilpancingo, which declared independence, promulgated a rudimentary constitution, and called for the abolition of caste distinctions. Morelos was captured and executed in 1815, but his ideals of equality and self-rule left a lasting impression on the populace. After his death, leaders such as Vicente Guerrero, Guadalupe Victoria, and numerous guerrilla bands carried on the struggle, waging a protracted resistance from the mountains and countryside, keeping the fight alive through years of hardship. A turning point came in 1820, when in Spain, the liberal faction forced King Ferdinand VII to restore the Cadiz constitution, thereby limiting royal authority. The royalist elites and clergy in New Spain, fearing the loss of their privileges, shifted their stance. Some officers who had once fought to preserve Spanish rule, including Agustín de Iturbide, changed sides. Iturbide negotiated with guerrilla leader Vicente Guerrero, and in February 1821 they proclaimed the Plan of Iguala, which rested on 3 principles: Mexico's independence, the preservation of Roman Catholicism, and equality between Spaniards and Criollos. In August of that year, the Treaty of Córdoba was signed, compelling Spain to recognize independence. On September 27, 1821, the united forces of Iturbide and Guerrero marched into Mexico City, formally ending more than 3 centuries of Spanish colonial rule. However, the war had left devastating consequences. The population had drastically declined, many mines and towns lay in ruins, production was paralyzed, and the treasury was bankrupt. Deep social divisions persisted among Criollos, mestizos, indigenous peoples, and Afro-descendants. Inequalities rooted in the colonial era did not simply disappear. Nevertheless, the 11-year struggle instilled a powerful sense of national pride and opened an era in which Mexico could determine its own destiny, laying the foundations for building an independent nation, though the political, economic, and social challenges of the 19th century still lay ahead. After gaining independence in 1821, Mexico faced the monumental task of building a unified nation from the ruins of war. At first, former General Agustín de Iturbide, who had played a decisive role in securing independence, proclaimed himself emperor and established the First Mexican Empire. However, this fledgling monarchy quickly collapsed due to a lack of support from both conservatives and liberals, an empty treasury, and increasingly fierce political divisions. In 1824, the federal constitution was enacted, officially transforming Mexico into a federal republic in which Roman Catholicism was enshrined as the sole state religion. Yet, the early Republican years soon descended into turmoil. The economy stagnated after the war, the national treasury lay depleted, and conservative and liberal factions constantly vied for power. In this context, the military, an institution inherited from the colonial era, emerged as a dominant political force. Many generals rose to power as caudillos, the most prominent being Antonio López de Santa Anna, who would dominate Mexican politics from the 1830s to the mid-1850s. Under Santa Anna's rule, Mexico faced one upheaval after another. In 1829, Spain attempted to reconquer Mexico but was repelled. In 1838, France launched an attack on the port of Veracruz in the so-called Pastry War, forcing Mexico to pay commercial reparations. Yet the gravest challenge came from the frontier province of Texas, where the Anglo-American settler population was rapidly growing. In 1836, Anglo settlers in Texas, nominally still part of Mexico, revolted against the central government and declared the independent Republic of Texas. Santa Anna personally led an army to suppress the rebellion, achieving a bloody victory at the Alamo but ultimately suffering defeat at San Jacinto, where he was captured and forced to recognize Texas's separation from Mexico. The situation worsened when the United States annexed Texas in 1845, triggering the Mexican-American War. The United States Army, with overwhelming strength, invaded deep into Mexican territory and occupied the capital, Mexico City. Defeated, the Mexican government was compelled to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ceding nearly half of its territory to the United States, a loss known as the Mexican Cession. This vast concession included present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and much of Colorado. The blow was not only geographical but also psychological, leaving a deep historical wound and a legacy of bitterness in Mexico-United States relations. After the war, the prestige of the conservative ruling elite collapsed. The already weakened economy was left in ruins, fertile lands were lost, and the national budget plunged into crisis. In 1854, liberal politicians led by Benito Juárez launched the Ayutla Revolution, overthrowing Santa Anna's dictatorship and paving the way for a period of sweeping reforms. Thus, the First Republic came to an end amid social unrest and financial exhaustion. Yet it was precisely these upheavals that laid the foundation for radical liberal reforms, opening the door to rebuilding the nation on new democratic and legal principles in the second half of the 19th century. In the latter half of the 19th century, Mexico experienced intense political and social upheaval as liberal and conservative forces struggled bitterly to define the nation's future. After the overthrow of Santa Anna, the liberals seized power and launched La Reforma, a sweeping wave of reforms beginning in 1855. The Constitution of 1857 was enacted, establishing progressive principles such as the separation of church and state, equality before the law, the abolition of Catholic Church privileges, and the confiscation of church and indigenous communal lands to create a free land market. These reforms sought to modernize Mexico along secular and capitalist lines, but they also provoked fierce resistance from conservatives whose interests were deeply tied to the church and the old order. The result was the Reform War, fought between President Benito Juárez's liberal government and conservative insurgents. The Civil War ended with a liberal victory, but the country lay exhausted, and conservatives remained determined to restore their power. Seeking foreign support, Mexico's conservative nobility allied with the French Empire. Exploiting Juárez's suspension of foreign debt payments, Emperor Napoleon III sent troops to invade Mexico in 1861 and installed Maximilian von Habsburg as Emperor of the Second Mexican Empire in 1864. This Second Empire was a short-lived attempt to restore monarchy. Although some aristocratic circles supported Maximilian, the majority of Mexicans, especially the liberals, remained loyal to Juárez's republic. After the United States Civil War, the U.S. pressured France to withdraw its forces. Deprived of support, the puppet empire collapsed. In 1867, Republican troops retook Mexico City. Maximilian was captured and executed, and the republic was restored. This marked a resounding victory for liberalism and national sovereignty against foreign intervention. Following the war, Benito Juárez continued as president, working to rebuild the nation between 1867 and 1872. Yet divisions emerged within the liberal camp itself, between radicals and moderates. After Juárez's death in 1872, political instability cleared the path for a new figure to rise, General Porfirio Díaz, a hero of the resistance against France. In 1876, Díaz launched a coup and seized power, inaugurating the Porfiriato, a regime that would last 35 years. Under Porfirio Díaz, Mexico achieved political stability and notable economic growth. His motto was Orden y Progreso, order and progress, a centralized authoritarian government that crushed uprisings to preserve order. His administration pursued modernization aggressively, building railways, telegraph lines, and promoting foreign investment in mining, plantation agriculture, and light industry. By the end of the 19th century, Mexico's economy was revitalized. Silver and commodity exports surged. Many cities were electrified, society became increasingly urban, and a small middle class began to emerge. However, the darker side of the Porfiriato was deepening social inequality. Land became concentrated in the hands of large landowners and foreign investors, while peasants were dispossessed and reduced to impoverished tenant farmers. Concentrated power also bred corruption and political despotism. Opposition was crushed, the press censored, and the 1857 Constitution rendered meaningless in practice. By 1910, when the 80-year-old Díaz announced yet another re-election after more than 3 decades in power, social discontent reached a breaking point, setting the stage for the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution at the dawn of the 20th century. In 1910, the Mexican Revolution erupted, one of the greatest revolutionary upheavals in Latin American history, shaking the nation's political and social order to its very core. The deep-rooted causes lay in the contradictions of the Porfiriato regime. Impoverished peasants demanded land reform, workers and laborers sought greater rights, and liberal intellectuals grew outraged at authoritarian rule. In November 1910, Francisco I. Madero, a wealthy landowner with liberal ideals, called for an uprising to overthrow Díaz. His appeal quickly rallied diverse forces: the urban middle class, workers, and, above all, peasants. Grassroots leaders such as Emiliano Zapata in the south and Pancho Villa in the north became iconic champions of the struggle for land for the poor. Under revolutionary pressure, Porfirio Diaz was forced to resign and go into exile in mid-1911. Madero became president through democratic elections later that year, raising hopes for moderate reform. Yet the fragile new order was immediately tested. In February 1913, General Victoriano Huerta staged a coup, overthrowing and assassinating Madero, and established a military dictatorship. This brutal act ignited a full-scale civil war between revolutionary factions and Huerta's regime. In the north, revolutionary forces united under Venustiano Carranza, along with commanders such as Pancho Villa and Álvaro Obregón. In the south, Zapata's peasant armies continued their fierce resistance. The conflict devastated vast rural areas. By mid-1914, Huerta's regime collapsed, but the revolutionary factions soon turned against each other over Mexico's future. Carranza ultimately defeated his rivals by 1915 to 1916, consolidating control of the country. In 1917, Mexico adopted a new constitution, a pioneering and revolutionary document that remains in effect today. It enshrined sweeping social reforms, redistribution of land, labor rights, strict separation of church and state, and national sovereignty over natural resources such as oil. Politically, it established a federal republic with a 4-year presidential term but prohibited re-election, a direct lesson from Diaz's dictatorship. Venustiano Carranza became the first president under the new constitution, yet violence persisted. Carranza was assassinated in 1920, and other revolutionary generals, such as Álvaro Obregón and Plutarco Elias Calles, subsequently rose to power. The revolutionary decade from 1910 to 1920 is estimated to have cost the lives of about 1/10 of Mexico's population, a devastating toll. Nevertheless, the revolution succeeded in dismantling Porfirio Diaz's feudal landowning system and laid the foundation for a more modern state, with social justice commitments inscribed in the Constitution. After the Civil War, to prevent renewed chaos, revolutionary leaders sought to stabilize power. In 1929, former President Plutarco Calles brought together the various revolutionary factions to form the National Revolutionary Party, the precursor to the Institutional Revolutionary Party. This organization functioned as a political machine that mediated competition among generals and revolutionary leaders, ensuring continuous governance. From this point onward, Mexico entered a new era in which political order was institutionalized under the dominance of a single party. The modern era of Mexico is marked by the long dominance of the Institutional Revolutionary Party and profound economic and social transformations throughout the 20th century, before shifting toward multi-party politics in recent decades. The one-party era and the Mexican miracle. Beginning in 1929, the PRI, officially named in 1946, became the virtually absolute ruling force, controlling both central and local governments for decades. Between 1940 and 1970, Mexico benefited from a favorable international context and domestic industrial development policies, creating the so-called Mexican miracle, a period of high and stable economic growth. Under PRI presidents, the government pursued import substitution industrialization, investing heavily in domestic industries, establishing state-owned enterprises, and imposing tariffs to protect local production. World War II and the post-war years brought major opportunities. Mexico sided with the Allies, provided strategic metals, and sent laborers to the United States through the Bracero program, securing foreign currency and technology for development. As a result, Mexico's economy grew at an average of about 6% annually for several decades. Per capita income rose, and the middle class expanded. The 1938 nationalization of oil under President Lázaro Cárdenas, along with other key sectors, gave the state control over strategic resources. At the same time, public education and healthcare expanded, while the population exploded from about 20 million in 1940 to nearly 50 million in 1970, as waves of laborers moved into cities, reshaping the social landscape. However, this period also had a darker side: concentrated power and a lack of democracy. Although PRI presidents rotated every 6 years without re-election, in practice, all electoral processes were orchestrated by the ruling party, leaving no real competition. The PRI maintained stability through a blend of repression and co-optation, tightly controlling the press and labor unions while cracking down on major dissent, such as the 1968 Tlatelolco massacre, when the army opened fire on student demonstrators, leaving hundreds dead and wounded. At the same time, the PRI skillfully incorporated some opposition elements into the system and enacted just enough social reforms to appease the public. This model of the institutional revolutionary state allowed Mexico to avoid military coups or civil wars, unlike many other Latin American countries, but also stifled democratic progress. By the 1970s, the economic miracle began to falter. The late 1970s and early 1980s oil crises caused prices to plummet, while Mexico had borrowed heavily to finance development, leading to the 1982 debt crisis. The government declared it could not meet its obligations, plunging the economy into deep recession. This forced Mexico to abandon its closed ISI model and adopt IMF-backed market liberalization reforms. Under Presidents Miguel de la Madrid and Carlos Salinas de Gortari, Mexico privatized many state-owned enterprises, cut back protectionism, and attracted foreign investment. The 1917 Constitution was amended to reduce the state's economic role and allow private and international investors into previously restricted sectors. At the same time, the government eased relations with the Catholic Church, ending a long-standing standoff dating back to the Revolution. A major turning point came in 1994 when Mexico, the United States, and Canada implemented the North American Free Trade Agreement, ushering in an era of deep economic integration with North America. NAFTA boosted trade and investment dramatically, fostering industries such as automobiles, electronics, and maquiladoras, export assembly plants. Yet free trade also intensified competition, leaving many small farmers unable to compete with imported agricultural products, thereby deepening inequality. In politics, the 1980s and 1990s saw growing demands for democratization. In 1985, the Mexico City earthquake and the government's poor response provoked strong public criticism. The 1988 presidential election marked a peak of controversy, widely suspected of massive fraud to secure victory for the PRI candidate, as the computerized vote counting system suddenly crashed just as the opposition candidate was leading. Under pressure, the PRI was forced to reform electoral laws, allowing independent monitoring and more competitive local elections in the 1990s. Opposition parties such as the National Action Party and the Party of the Democratic Revolution began winning gubernatorial races, laying the groundwork for the end of the PRI's 71-year grip on federal power. The historic milestone came in the 2000 presidential election when opposition candidate Vicente Fox of the National Action Party won, becoming the first non-PRI president since 1929, a clear sign that Mexico's democratization had made tangible progress. Although democracy has taken deeper roots since 2021st century, Mexico still faces grave challenges, especially drug-related violence and corruption. Beginning in 2006, President Felipe Calderón launched a large-scale war on drugs to crush powerful cartels. The army and police were heavily deployed, and many cartel leaders were killed or captured, but the campaign triggered an explosion of violence as cartels fought for territory and exacted revenge. The result was tens of thousands of civilian and security force deaths in just a few years, with many regions descending into chaos. The drug war remains Mexico's most pressing security crisis, while corruption among officials and security forces makes crime fighting even harder. Politically, Mexico continued to shift among parties after the PRI lost its monopoly. In 2012, the PRI returned to power with the victory of Enrique Peña Nieto, who promised to reform the party and boost economic growth. However, corruption scandals and rising criminal violence during his presidency eroded the PRI's credibility. In 2018, Mexican voters delivered another political turning point by electing Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a leftist candidate from the National Regeneration Movement, as president. His victory ended the PRI pan-alternation and reflected the people's desire for profound change. López Obrador's government pledged to prioritize the poor, fight corruption, and reduce violence, though it still faces major challenges in fulfilling those ambitious promises. Looking back on its tumultuous historical journey, from the brilliance of ancient civilizations through 3 centuries of colonial rule to revolutionary struggles and modernization efforts, Mexico has constantly transformed in order to adapt and grow. Each historical period has borne the mark of significant political, social, and economic upheavals, all of which have shaped a Mexico that is diverse and resilient today. Though the nation still faces many pressing challenges, its rich history and vibrant culture continue to guide it forward on the path of strengthening democracy and prosperity, writing new chapters for the future